Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started this session. Thank you all for being here, particularly to a place that's not the easiest ever place to find. So welcome to this session of the Manchester Wesley Research Centre at AAR. I'm Jordan Hammond. I'm the director of the centre. The Wesley Centre recently became a related scholarly organization of AAR, and related to that, we're for the second year holding a session here at AAR. So the centre was established in 2003, and it's a partnership of institutions and community of scholars working together to promote and research in the Methodist, Wesleyan, and evangelical traditions, broadly understood. It serves as a resource for students, for scholars, and particularly for those from the partner institutions of the Wesley Centre, of which there are a number of representatives here today. So if you're interested in what those are, the partner institutions, there's a handout that I'll pass around that has them listed. In this setting, I want to particularly highlight two things for those of you who may be interested in involvement with the Wesley Centre in some ways. All of our public lectures, like the annual lecture that we have each June, are live streamed online and recorded and put on our YouTube page, and so you can participate in that wherever you happen to be living. And we have three visiting fellow programs for which we're currently accepting applications. And so if you or a colleague you know is interested in coming over to Manchester for a period of research, particularly something relating to Methodist and Wesleyan studies, but not completely exclusive to that, then I will pass around a flyer that has some information about those, so feel free to take one for yourself or someone you know who may be interested in that. So today we're highlighting the research of 4 different visiting research fellows of the Centre. And the session highlights various facets of their research. The first one looks at John Wesley's political thought, analysis of his political and social tracts. We have 3 papers that will focus on early 19th century Methodism in Britain. One looks at the struggle for theological coherence in early 19th century Methodism, evaluates a controversy involving 2 doctrines central to Methodism: justification by faith and witness of the Spirit. And then 2 papers that examine attitudes to women in ministry in the Wesleyan and Primitive Methodist traditions. One analyzes Henry Moore's biography of Methodist preacher Mary Fletcher, and another one looking at Hugh Borne's defense of women preachers. So we hope collectively these give a sense of the wide range of possibilities for research on Methodism and evangelical traditions, utilizing resources in the UK and particularly in Manchester. So the format for the session, we've got 4 papers, about 25 minutes for each paper, 10 minutes for questions at the end. Each paper has a chair who will introduce the speaker and take questions at the end. After the first 2 papers, we'll have a break and then come back for the last 2. I have a sheet that I'll pass around just to get the names of those who are here. Please put your email address, particularly if you're interested in finding out about future sessions. That's not you're not obliged to do that, though. And if you want to join the Wesley Centre email mailing list and you're not on that, then you can indicate that on the sheet as well. So thank you all for being here, and we'll move to the first paper from Glen O'Brien. Doug Strong is going to chair this.
Good afternoon. It is my privilege to introduce our first paper for this afternoon. It will be given by Glen O'Brien, who is at the Eva Burrows College of the University of Divinity. His paper is entitled Liberty and Loyalty, the Political World of John Wesley. I'm very much looking forward to this. The thesis is quite intriguing, and I'm sure that you will find it interesting as well. We'll have the paper for about 25 minutes, and I'll try to make sure that we keep on time with that so that we may have enough time for questions. So please be thinking about those as he's presenting the paper. Glen?
Thank you very much, and just let me begin by thanking Jordan for the invitation to be here at the American Academy of Religion, and also to the Manchester Wesley Research Centre for the generosity in providing me the opportunity to come across and to engage in research which, at least in part, informs this larger project. This paper is a broad overview of themes in a monograph that I have recently completed, at least, well, it's not in final form yet, but pretty close to draft final form, that's currently out in peer review with T&T Clark. It has the provisional title, Liberty and Loyalty, John Wesley's Political World, and though quite a bit has been done in theologically reflecting on Wesley's political tracts, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that work, my approach is to take a strictly historical approach, employing a global history methodology. The paper today is drawing on material in the introductory and concluding sections of the book in order to highlight a number of findings in the work. So it doesn't involve a close analysis of texts. It's more a broad brushstroke of what was discovered through the larger project. John Wesley's political world was a global one, since British politics in the long 18th century were entangled in Britain's development as an imperial power. From a rather insular country, far from the centre of European power in the 17th century, England had become Britain, and Britain had become great. This came through a combination of its participation in global wars, the creation of a modern financial system, the Bank of England having been founded in 1694, industrial innovation and growth, and a series of monarchs, especially in the case of George III, who insisted on taking an active role in foreign affairs in partnership with the Parliament. After the loss of the American colonies, Britain signed a triple alliance with the Dutch and the Prussians, heralding an end to a period of isolationist politics and bringing it back into a European orbit, something which seems to have been in process of reversing in recent times. News of the French Revolution beginning in 1789 was at first received with little alarm, since the descent of the French state into a weakness brought on by internal chaos only seemed to fulfil a long-held British desire to see France finally disempowered. The final defeat of France in 1814-15 only came after Britain committed astonishing amounts of money, supplies and troops to support its allies, some of them new allies such as the Spanish, who resisted Napoleon on the Iberian Peninsula in 1808. The cost was high, but it had brought Britain squarely into the European sphere, where it was influential in brokering a peace at the Congress of Vienna that followed the outline of its foreign policy interests. All of this preparation and demobilisation from one war to the next was an expensive business, but it transformed Britain's geopolitical position from a rather insular and provincial kingdom perched on the edge of Europe to a leading global power. But the wealth generated by this newfound prominence did not always trickle down to the poorer elements of British society, sections of which had found a new sense of agency as a result of the evangelical revival. The Methodist movement opened up a social, if not a political revolution, which gave large numbers of ordinary people a new type of agency based on a filial relationship with God through Jesus Christ. The person known and loved by God and gifted with the Spirit of God was not trapped in their circumstances, but through temperate living, honesty, thrift and industry could make an impact on the world for their own good and for the good of others. This new world would flow into the 19th century, a century of both individual and collective action for representative democracy, people power, and we of course live on the other side of those impulses. It is impossible to separate religious vitality from this greatness, since the 18th century was an era of religious renewal movements, of which Methodism, even if perhaps it's the most conspicuous, was very far from the only participant. In spite of frequently claiming that politics was not the business of preachers, John Wesley engaged vigorously in the political discourse of his era, just as he engaged his considerable intellectual powers on many other matters besides religion, such as the tendency of polymaths. Not content to restrict his inquiring mind to a narrow field, he took an interest in the natural sciences, in history, in economics, in languages. Why not then politics? The only area that did not seem to interest him in other than a passing way were the dramatic arts, about which he had little to say other than to be dismissive of them as frivolous and morally questionable. Pamela Edwards sees the political philosophy of the 18th century changing in three main ways. First, it developed as an extension of the debate over human nature, so that politics and empiricism came together to consider the nature of the person as an acting, feeling, thinking, social being. Second, this discussion took place in terms of a civil discourse over contract. What were the obligations that existed or ought to exist between a government and its people? Finally, with the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707, a British national identity emerged as distinct from a more narrowly English one. Wesley's political tracts reflect each of these changes, although Wesley is often more parochially English in his sentiment. His political tracts are profoundly social and personal, in delineating the obligations of trust that are to exist between the king, the parliament, and the people. They consistently reject, however, on both historical and pragmatic grounds, John Locke's social contract theory, with its idea that nations govern only by the consent of the governed. Locke's two treatises of government, 1690, rejected the idea earlier advanced in Robert Filmer's Patriarcha of 1680, that the king held a power derived from God to watch over his subjects as a loving father watches over his children. Locke did not reject the idea that government had a theological foundation, but he linked divine law with natural law to describe an original state of nature in which human beings held certain natural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and property. These were gifts of God and hence inalienable. While Locke never argued for the abolition of the monarchy, he did locate sovereignty among the people who offered their consent to be governed by the rule of law. In the extreme circumstance in which this social contract was broken by a tyrant, the people had a right to resist and demand a restoration of the original terms of the contract, so that trust between the people and the government was the glue that held this social contract together. Though this model is based on the personal element of trust, we will see that Wesley's own political philosophy, if it could even be called that, places loyalty at the centre of the social contract. Loyalty to God, to the king, to the parliament, and to that ancient constitution which was the surest guarantee of the people's liberty. Though he was a self-described Tory, he did not believe the king could act independently of this constitutional arrangement. Loyalty to the king meant loyalty to the king in Parliament. Stephen J. Plant has identified liberty and order as one of two base pairs of the Methodist genome derived from Wesley, along with evangelism and social holiness, with the latter, evangelism and social holiness, taking precedence over the former, liberty and order. I accept the ordering of priority, but suggest liberty and loyalty rather than liberty and order as better reflecting the more personal and experiential approach in Wesley's social and political thought. These two mutually supporting themes in Wesley's political thought fit squarely into the mentalities that dominated the Atlantic world of the long 18th century. Natural liberty was a divine gift, and that though every person is born free, the protection and maintenance of civil and religious liberty is the responsibility of the state. The surest and safest way to maintain liberty was through loyalty to the crown. Within such a system of submission to an anointed and benevolent monarch, armed violent rebellion against the crown, such as took place in the American colonies and also threatened the home country itself, was, of course, an unthinkable horror. In all of his political and social tracts, Wesley reflects a view of the Hanoverian kings as possessing a sacred aura and deserving of an almost unquestioning trust. It is simplistic, however, to think of Wesley as a Tory who therefore supported the divine right of kings as a matter of course, when in fact both his views and those of the Tories themselves in Parliament had undergone development in such a manner as to allow support for the Hanoverian succession based not merely on hereditary succession. Wesley never understood the king to have a right to act in a tyrannical way without regard to the constitutional arrangements set in place in the Glorious Revolution. Ted Webber has argued that Wesley's political commitments were not based on any abstract theory, but had a personal and communal structure. Certainly, order was highly prized by Wesley, but the personal element, I would argue, remains central. Order itself is a rather abstract term, but loyalty is deeply personal, whether expressed in affection for the king, love for the people, or aversion to the profligate and disloyal John Wilkes. Wesley's own connection of preachers was built on loyalty to himself and the doctrines and disciplines he set in place. So the organic constitutionalism of Wesley was founded on an understanding of the contractual arrangement between king and people embedded in the ancient constitution, now seen as under threat by seditious forces. Loyalty to the king had a strongly personal element because, like Jesus, the king was a person. Wesley preached a gospel that offered Christ to miners, agricultural workers, artisans and the rising middling sort who knew little of doctrinal and liturgical niceties, but whose instinct for religion proved strong and lasting. This offer of Christ was fully in keeping with the turn to the person inherent in the Enlightenment project, an enthusiasm both rational and religious. When it came to politics, this personal approach was of a piece with his religious views. Did not the scriptures teach devout believers to fear God and honour the king? Was the king not a loving father of his people? Republicanism, rioting, avoidance of taxes, aspersions on the king's good name, these were all acts of ingratitude, unbecoming of those seeking perfection. This Methodist piety was not a selfish moralism, however, because the personal integrity it called for was exercised as part of a social contract held together by a compact of trust. Wesley was somewhat discriminating in his support for monarchs. He was not a royalist in the sense of giving all monarchs a free pass on their behaviour. Indeed, he considered many of them to have been moral degenerates. It was the king or queen who loved God and country who was deserving of unwavering support. No Stuart monarch could fit such a description because such a monarch was obligated by religious ties to papal and thus foreign power. The greater freedom given to expressions of political dissent during the reign of George III was alarming for Wesley, partly because of his rejection of mob violence, something which he had considerable personal experience of, and because of the association of opposition politics with dissenters. Unorthodox theological views such as Arianism and Unitarianism seemed strange bedfellows to one as deeply committed to the Anglican formularies as John Wesley. It is not that there were no such views to be found in the Church of England, but Wesley had a very distinct and tightly held set of beliefs about the true religion that had been entrusted to the state church. For him, the religion of the Bible, the religion of the primitive church, and the religion of the Church of England were of a piece. Given that so many of the more Republican voices of the era, such as Richard Price and Joseph Towers, were dissenters, it is not hard to see how Wesley's political sentiments may have been informed by his theological commitments. Being Anglican was by no means a sufficient buffer against seditious ideas, of course. After all, the radical politician John Wilkes was at least nominally an Anglican. Here again, the personal element is likely to have coloured Wesley's political response to Wilkes. The morally bankrupt and sexually promiscuous Wilkes could hardly have drawn anything but censure from one as monkish and disciplined as John Wesley. That such a scurrilous rake as Wilkes should impugn the name of a godly king like George III and trumpet ideas that undermined the social contract of loyalty was simply beyond the pale. This is not to say that Wesley failed carefully to weigh up Wilkes's political ideas before finding them wanting, but it does indicate the personal element in the disagreement. In rejecting the idea that political power originated with the people, Wesley was attempting to, quote, resist the patriot mob. The origin of all political power, he argued, lay with God, who had delegated it to certain representatives to whom due reverence and submission should be given. John Wesley was almost as adept in the language of liberty that pervaded his era as figures such as John Locke or Thomas Paine, even if he took a different approach from them. Civil and religious liberty were highly prized for Wesley, but cries that these were being withheld from the English people by a despotic king and a corrupt and dictatorial ministry simply did not pass Wesley's test of veracity. Wesley's opposition to the American Revolution is the best known feature of his political outlook. It was not because he did not share with Americans a concern for civil and religious liberty that he staunchly opposed Republican ideas. Indeed, he initially showed sympathy for Americans who were disadvantaged by the intolerable acts. Americans were, after all, his people, British, Protestant, and increasingly evangelical. Only when their rhetoric shifted from liberty to independence did he begin to lose his love for the Americans. His accusations of a long-held plot to throw off the yoke of the British Crown were informed by Joseph Galloway, who had argued in the First Continental Congress, without success, for keeping the colonies united to George III. Galloway claimed that the revolution was rooted in principles of dissent that could be traced to the original 17th century establishment of the colonies, which further fed into Wesley's suspicion of dissenters and dissenting theology. Global political crises were, in Wesley's view, always opportunities for personal repentance. In virtually all of his political tracts, there is a call to respond with repentance and faith toward looming international crises. God was at work among the nations to sweep them out with a broom of destruction as an instrument of divine judgment. Should all the liberties enjoyed by British subjects be suddenly swept away, what refuge would be left other than to be held in the bosom of a redeeming God? Wesley's political world was characterised by this personal element, and this should not surprise us, since his field preaching constituted an appeal to ordinary people to see themselves as objects of Christ's dying love, to seek refuge in his wounds, and as happy children to rush to the embrace of a crucified God. This may seem overly individualistic in an age like our own, where political change is seen in terms of collective action, but it reflects the emphasis on the agency of the person typical of the 18th century. Methodism, after all, was the religion of the first person personal pronoun, with a stress on personal agency that provided an avenue of individual choice that would lead in the 19th century to a wider participation of the ordinary person in the social sphere, including in the world of politics. How much time have I got left?
8 minutes.
8 minutes, great, thanks. Perhaps the most surprising element for me was encountering Wesley's virtual determinism. More virulent and anti-Calvinist than any other 18th century figure, Wesley nonetheless held a providential view of history in which God's purposes for the nations could not be frustrated by any human action. His rejection of unconditional election and divine decrees of predestination on the personal level sat alongside a doctrine of God's sovereignty over public affairs as seemingly deterministic as any Calvinists. This comes through most clearly in the hortatory exhortations to repentance that frequently appear at the end of his political tracts, and in his eventual admission that the American Revolution, something, remember, which he opposed for the entire duration of the war, was in the end understood by Wesley to be an event permitted by providence, and thus something to be accepted as a new political reality. One section of the community of the people called Methodist was now also an American people, and their theological identity was for Wesley more determinative than the political arrangements under which they lived. Reverent and passive submission to constituted authority was the overarching biblical principle that Wesley affirmed, and such a principle would now be lived out for some Methodists under the conditions set in place under the American Constitution, and for others under the King in Parliament. Wesley was one of the most widely travelled people in 18th century Britain, and his published journals are a rollicking ride over hill and dale that provide us with a fascinating portrait of town and country life in the Georgian age. I'm sure I don't need to tell an audience like this something like that. But the first-hand exposure to the lives and conditions of ordinary people gives Wesley's reflections on the state of the nation, including its trade, levels of employment and population demographics, a vivid authenticity not always found in estimates made at a cool distance. A number of John Wesley's social and political tracts between 1762 and 1778 dealt with issues of economy and trade, and the impact of these upon the British population, and especially upon the poor. A Word to a Smuggler, 1762, Thoughts on the Present Scarcity of Provisions, 1773, Serious Address to the People of England with regard to the state of the nation, 1778. These tracts show that while he was no economist, he nonetheless understood the systemic impact of economic and trade practices on the general population. He had no objection to prosperous commercial enterprise. In fact, he celebrated it as part of the strength of Protestant Britain's maritime dominance of the Atlantic world. But he did argue against luxury among the wealthy, along with distilling, which he saw as leading causes of the inflation in prices, a rise in unemployment and a shortage of foodstuffs. His economic advice may have been naive in some respects, but he did at least offer practical solutions designed to ease pressure on the poor, including placing an export tax on horses, destined for French chasers, and placing a ceiling on the cost of farm leases. Though his love for the poor was genuine and his preference for their company was made clear in his itinerant lifestyle, at the same time there is in Wesley a moralism that can only be described as evincing a lack of sympathy for and even victim blaming of the troubled poor. Those who bought smuggled goods, even if ordered to survive, would be better off to starve than to steal or buy smuggled goods. Employers, in fact, he told Cornish employers, they should refuse to employ anyone who had been convicted of smuggling. You've got to remember that in some of these remote Cornish communities, smuggling was so woven into the fabric of the economy that one could barely survive without some participation in it. Some were rebuked who had no thought of God in good times and now turned to repentance during their time of need. Others were asked whether their laziness might have had anything to do with their present poverty. The bodies of suicides should be hung in the streets as a public warning against others tempted to the sin of self-murder. These are rather jarring instances of a lack of compassion that stand out in some bold relief, given our usual assumption about Wesley being an overall compassionate kind of person. When it came to practical solutions, Wesley was not satisfied with individual responsibility alone. He saw a place for government intervention through taxation and trade policies that might alleviate food shortages, and he advised the Prime Minister on such matters. He seemed to approve of the newer economic theories of Adam Smith, including that a fixed price on goods was an outmoded approach in the face of market fluctuations. But like Smith, he was keenly aware of the social dimensions of economic practices. Even though practical systemic solutions were offered, Wesley deemed the chief causes of want to be the gluttony and luxury of the wealthy, so individual morality remained an important factor in addressing poverty.
2 minutes.
Thank you. All right. In the next 2 minutes, I will come to my concluding thoughts. For John Wesley, Great Britain was Protestant, maritime, commercial and free, to use a kind of definition that has present currency in 18th century studies. Protestant, maritime, commercial and free, and thus exhibited qualities that in Wesley's mind made it a bulwark against tyranny, isolation and want. And Wesley's political ideas extended well into the 19th century as British Wesleyan Methodism developed into a vigorous and growing denomination. Though increasingly situated more in nonconformity than Anglicanism, it retained a degree of deference toward the Church of England and issued many attestations of loyalty to the Crown. Wars with France in the Napoleonic era contributed to shoring up of this loyalty to the existing British political establishment as a safeguard against tyranny and revolution. It's interesting to note also that British Wesleyans failed to support the various mid-century industrial and agricultural reform bills, which underscores their essentially conservative outlook. Though, of course, there are always exceptions. There have been some demographic studies of voting patterns which show that sometimes Wesley and Methodists did vote in favour of reform, and sometimes the so-called minor Methodists did not. So that's a broad brushstroke. So my final paragraph. Liberty and loyalty are the twin themes that help crystallise John Wesley's political outlook. Liberty was a divinely given capacity to which every person had as much right as breathing. While the origin of political power lay with God, human governments had the responsibility of preserving both civil and religious liberty. The surest guarantee of such liberty was through the ancient constitution, given its purest embodiment in the constitutional arrangements of the glorious revolution of 1688. A devout Protestant king would rule over a grateful people while being held accountable to God and to the Parliament for his actions as a check on tyranny. This was a form of social contract, and loyalty to that contract would check seditious and rebellious grabs for power. Sentiments expressed by Republican voices in America masked more sinister ambitions. I'm voicing Wesley here, you understand. I'm not giving you my opinion. I'm trying to verbalise his opinions. A more sinister ambition, an overthrow of the ancient constitution of Britain to be replaced by a democracy of the people. In the end, however, the hand of an all-wise providence guided historical forces, and the best response to political fluctuations was a personal one, to make God one's friend through repentance and faith. John Wesley was not a politician or an economist or a military strategist. He was a priest, he was an evangelist, so that his political world ultimately existed as a subset of a world bounded by the cosmic drama of salvation. Thank you.
We'll go ahead with some questions. I'm going to lead off with one of my own. And thank you very much, Glen, for that excellent paper. What I found particularly helpful was how you showed that Wesley's political commitments were linked very much to the personal element and to the agency of the individual. Which brings me to a question. You, at the very beginning of the paper, you talked about those factors that led to Britain in the long 18th century becoming such a power. But what you didn't mention in those factors was colonization and slavery,
Yes, thank you.
which really provided the wealth that funded these political advancements.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you would see Wesley's commitments to the personal and to
Yes.
human agency in terms of those who were those who were enslaved or colonized.
Yes. Thanks for that question, Doug. I do have a chapter on slavery in the book, and I recognise it's a missing element of this presentation. As you know, the campaign to end slavery in the British colonies doesn't really get underway till the 1770s, and so Wesley's thoughts upon slavery is one of the earlier tracts from a non-Quaker source to address it. But absolutely, the language of liberty that he applies to British citizens of the Crown, he employs that same language of liberty. For example, he speaks about freedom or liberty being a natural gift of God in respect to slaves, that they have as much right to liberty as they have to breathing their native air. So I think the overarching kind of philosophy about human freedom, Wesley does absolutely apply it to the case of those held in bondage in slavery. And I've recently published a chapter in a book that compares John Wesley and George Whitefield on a whole range of issues, and the chapter that I contributed was on slavery. So as you know, Wesley and Whitefield had different approaches to the question of slavery. But one of the interesting things I came across in Wesley's journal was his conviction that on one occasion he preached in Bristol against slavery. And a strange kind of supernatural phenomenon occurred where he describes it as like thunder entering into the room, and the seats upon which people were sitting were all sort of crashing down and falling, and people went into a panic thinking there was some natural thing like an earthquake happening, and they started to run for the doors to escape. And Wesley's reflection on it was that he believed that supernatural powers were at work to resist his anti-slavery message. And he said, I never saw anything like it ever before, which is typical of Wesley to overstate things. But that was interesting to me, that he saw that principalities and powers in heavenly places were involved in the anti-slavery struggle. So it was not only a political campaign, but also a very kind of a supernaturalized clash of powers as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Others? David?
This is more of a comment than a question, but I think that the American Methodists should be very happy to you for providing an explanation of Article 23 in the Methodist discipline, in which all Methodist clergy are obliged to be loyal to Congress.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Thank you.
Glen, thanks for a splendid paper.
Hello, Tom. It's lovely to see
A
you.
couple of questions about the genesis of Wesley's views. We generally think of him as more influenced by Susanna than Samuel, but of course they had this famous disagreement over the Revolution of 1688, and if we have two kings, okay, we must have two heads,
Yes.
and so on. But in this case, it seems as if John was more influenced by Samuel's acceptance of
Yes.
the Revolution. Would that be true? And
Yes.
my second question to hang on to that, you describe him as a Tory, and of course we understand that in the 18th century context. But up until 1760, of course, the government was dominated by the aristocratic Whigs. Now, after George III came to the throne, of course, that fitted his picture. But do we have any evidence for him differentiating between the king and his ministers in the pre-1760 period?
I'm not sure I can, with authority, respond to the second part of your question, or your second question. Wesley was suspected of Jacobite sympathies during his Oxford days as a student there, and he read non-juror authors who were identified with the Jacobite cause. And he responds to that by stating that he is not a Jacobite, and he defines what a Jacobite is and says, by such a definition, I never was and am not now a Jacobite. But that was a defensive move against, this very dangerous and seditious kind of accusation. And of course, the term Tory is a slippery one, because we use it today in quite a different way than the way it was used in the 18th century. And even in the 18th century, there were Tories and there were Tories. There were Tories with a view of the king as having a divine right by succession, by hereditary succession. But in debates between Whigs and Tories over, especially since the 1688 Glorious Revolution, there had to be some other way of dealing with the divine right, so-called, that was invested in monarchs, since there was no longer a hereditary monarchy, and the Jacobites could make that claim in regard to their own claims, to the Stuart line. And so both Whigs and Tories had brokered a kind of a compromise deal where they looked to things such as the hand of Providence, and as being, in other words, one didn't have to rely on hereditary questions to legitimise the king. But the more precise question about dating, that's not something I'd want to hazard a guess on.
One more question.
Did Wesley's support for the monarchy tied in with the fact that he was king of the Methodists?
There's certainly, I think that's a factor. Wesley was a benevolent dictator, sometimes not so benevolent, but his view of authority was very much a top-down kind of authority model. So I think that is a part of it. Of course, increasingly Wesley's claim to be, we saw in some of our earlier papers that the loyalty and the discipline that Wesley expected of the Methodists was not always returned to him, and that we have to read the letters of the preachers in their personal networks to get an accurate picture of just how much Wesley's authority extended, because the published version of his authority in the journals is his picture of the way his authority functioned. But if we look at it as a history from below, how did the preachers think about? So we have, and of course, most famously in America, where Francis Asbury's like, well, the old man says this, and we all know he wants us to do that, but he doesn't understand conditions over here, so we'll make up our own mind about those kinds of questions. And I dare say you would find that rather cavalier attitude towards Wesley's authority, not just in America, but in more remote parts of Britain as well.
We thank Glen for not only this paper, but the book that we're looking forward as a result of it. Thank you very much.